Welcome to the debate. Imagine staring at a recently declassified government document. Your eyes scan the page and you can see the dates. You can see a heading like Project Phoenix. But the names, the specific locations, the actual outcomes, they are heavily redacted, blacked out entirely.
Yeah, just empty black boxes.
Exactly. You're left looking at this sanitized shadow of a document. And you have to wonder, is this still a true representation of what happened? Or is it just an empty frame? Today, we are diving into a tension that, frankly, every professional handling sensitive work eventually faces. You spend 2 years of your life on a massive, complex project. But because of the nature of the work, it is strictly confidential. But here's the reality. You still have to exist in the job market. You still have public surfaces, like a resume or a LinkedIn profile.
And you still have to prove your worth to people who, frankly, have no idea who you are.
Right. Now, the baseline rule we operate from in the material is clear. Some of the strongest work you will ever do is private or confidential. But that does not mean it must disappear. It means the advisor must create a public, safe rendering.
Which is a very specific process.
It is. A confidential project might be preserved privately in your own records as a highly detailed source entry, but the public version has to adapt. The public rendering might describe the type of work, the role, the environment, and the value pattern, but you absolutely cannot name the client, the proprietary systems, internal details, protected data, or confidential outcomes. The core question we are debating today is this. Does doing this fundamentally weaken your professional claim, or does it successfully preserve the truth of your capability? I will argue that public safe rendering is not weaker, but rather a governed, precise selection that protects both truth and boundary by communicating the exact value pattern.
And I will argue that while privacy is, of course, necessary, abstracting specific, verifiable details inherently dilutes the evidentiary strength of the claim, risking a slide into generic professionalism.
Let's get right into the friction of this, because I think it comes down to how we view the act of drafting these claims. Rendering isn't inventing, it is governed selection. You're looking at your private, highly detailed professional record and asking, what version of the truth belongs here for this specific audience, for this purpose?
Right.
Let's use a real-world healthcare example from the text. Say your private record reads, coordinated documentation for a massive, confidential hospital merger involving internal workflow changes, highly protected patient intake data, and a sensitive billing process review.
Yeah, the data privacy laws alone would end your career if you posted that on a public surface.
Precisely. You obviously can't blast that out there. So you render it, you make it public safe. You write something like, supported documentation coordination during a regulated healthcare implementation. Now, my stance is that the type of work is preserved here. The regulated environment is preserved. It is a responsibly bounded claim that points back to the real thing, the fully detailed private source entry. It is not weaker, it is just governed.
Okay, but let's pause right there. Supported documentation coordination during a regulated healthcare implementation. That phrasing is precisely the problem I have with this approach. We both know the entire foundation of demonstrating your value, especially according to the curriculum, is about avoiding the trap of flattening your work into generic professionalism.
I don't think it's flattening it.
But you just took an incredibly complex, high-stakes hospital merger involving sensitive patient data, something that takes real, specialized skill to navigate, and you flattened it into, paperwork.
It's not just paperwork, it's regulated documentation in a complex.
But to a hiring manager scanning 100 resumes on a Tuesday morning, it sounds like paperwork. The text explicitly tells advisors that claims must be source-backed. The market assigns value based on specificity. The difficulty of handling that specific patient data carries vastly more professional weight than the highly sanitized phrase you just used.
But you can't share the specific data. That's the whole point.
I agree. You can't share it, but if the audience cannot see the specific outcome or the context that made the work genuinely difficult in the first place, the rendering loses its trust density. The reader is just looking at a hollowed-out shell.
I completely agree that we have to protect privacy. Public safe rendering is a mandatory mechanism, but it is intellectually dishonest to claim it isn't, quote, weaker than a fully contextualized, transparent rendering. You have undeniably diluted the public weight of the claim.
I think we're getting tripped up on the word weaker here. In the context of the living professional record system, weaker implies a loss of truth or a loss of integrity. It implies the claim is somehow less true. Governed, on the other hand, simply implies an intentional filtering of audience-appropriate context. We have to remember that the surface is not the source.
But it is the primary filter for your future. If the surface isn't strong enough, nobody ever asks to see the source.
Sure, but think of it this way. Think of an architect trying to prove their capability to a prospective client. They might share a structural blueprint. That blueprint demonstrates their mastery of load-bearing design, spatial efficiency, and engineering. They don't need to publish the building's digital security codes or, the names of the executives who work in the corner offices or the corporate tenant's internal financial records just to prove that the building stands.
That's an interesting comparison.
The blueprint is an abstraction, yes. It intentionally leaves out highly sensitive data, but it is not a weak representation of their capability. It is a purpose-built, governed representation. The fact that details are left out doesn't make the remaining truth less true. It just makes it safe for the surface it's traveling on.
I really like the blueprint idea, but let's be honest about what the job market actually looks like and how professional rendering works. In your analogy, the security codes and the financials represent the unique constraints and the measurable outcomes of a job. And in our field, those exact things are very often what differentiate exceptional work from baseline competence.
You think leaving out the confidential outcome equates to hiding the competence?
Absolutely, when the outcome is the proof of the competence. Look, I've seen resumes so heavily sanitized to protect confidentiality that they literally sound like the person's job was just doing business at a place.
Doing business at a place, yeah, the classic facilitated synergy in a corporate environment.
Exactly. If we strip away the specific regulated system, the specific patient data constraints, and the confidential outcome, how do we distinguish your highly skilled healthcare professional from someone who merely did routine, low-stakes data entry and is now inflating their authority using that exact same vocabulary?
Well, they wouldn't have the source record to back it up.
But the recruiter doesn't see the source record initially. The architect's blueprint works because it is a highly technical document that other architects know how to read. But a resume bullet, a recruiter is scanning that for signals of scale and impact. If you say supported documentation coordination, you sound exactly like 1,000 other people who did basic filing. The uniqueness of your actual contribution is trapped in your private records. So yes, the remaining truth is true, but its signaling power in the market is objectively weaker because it is missing the context that proves it was actually hard to do.
So how do you solve that? Because we know we can't invent fake metrics and we can't expose the real ones. This is where the friction of distinguishing between measures of performance and measures of effectiveness really hits the road.
Right. Tool 4B requires defining evidence strength.
Exactly. We all know the difference in theory. Performance is your scale, your activity, your volume. Effectiveness is what actually changed and why it mattered. Applying that under the constraints of confidentiality is where true professional discipline comes in.
Right, because when your effectiveness metric is a highly classified dollar amount, people panic. They revert to generic performance metrics. They say, managed a team of 12, because they can't legally say, save the company $4 million in compliance fines.
Yes, but you aren't left entirely empty-handed just because the specific numbers are locked down. You can demonstrate a clear measure of effectiveness without exposing the proprietary mechanics. Let's actually workshop your criticism. You're saying supported documentation coordination sounds like doing business at a place. How do we show effectiveness safely? We focus on the qualitative change in state. We say, helped clarify workflow updates for internal stakeholders.
Okay, but
Let me finish the thought. Helped clarify workflow updates for internal stakeholders, stabilizing handoffs during a regulated healthcare implementation.
stabilizing handoffs.
Yes. It shows what changed. It shows why it mattered. You do not need to expose the proprietary workflow itself or the confidential merger details to claim the effectiveness of having clarified it. You just rely on the supported qualitative value. That is governed selection in practice, not a weak compromise.
Isn't a nice theory, but let's be realistic. When you rely entirely on qualitative phrasing like helped clarify workflow updates, you are bordering dangerously close to the vague excellence language that the source material explicitly bans. Let's really look at the friction here regarding evidence strength. When you sit down to weigh the strength of your evidence before you draft a public claim, what happens if your evidence strength rests entirely on a highly protected internal artifact?
Like the compliance victory you mentioned earlier?
Exactly. Let's say you are a cybersecurity professional. You identified a massive zero-day vulnerability in your company's proprietary software, and you patched it before a catastrophic breach occurred. That outcome is strictly confidential.
Right, you can't disclose the vulnerability.
You cannot talk about the vulnerability, the system, or the potential financial ruin you averted. So your public rendering is forced to omit the very thing that makes the claim powerful in the first place. You write something like, optimized risk management protocols to enhance system stability.
Which is an accurate governed statement.
But it is neutered. You are effectively asking the market to accept an enormous world-class capability based solely on their blind trust in your qualitative phrasing.
Not blind trust, source-backed trust.
But the reader can't see the source. The surface claim is totally disconnected from its most powerful proof points. Meanwhile, your competitor is out there shouting about how they saved $5 million, and, maybe they are overclaiming, maybe they're lying, but the recruiter sees the hard number. If I cannot tell the market about the massive disaster I averted, my measure of effectiveness is just a shadow. I am pointing to a black box and asking the audience to believe there is gold inside.
I see your point, but
And in a competitive market, pointing to a black box usually gets you ignored.
you are pointing to a black box, sure, but you aren't asking them to trust it forever. You are asking them to trust it just long enough to get you into the room. This is where we have to talk about the burden on rehydration and the surface-to-source link. A public safe rendering on a LinkedIn profile or a resume is an intentional compression. It is never meant to tell the whole story.
But it has to be enough to start the conversation.
Exactly. Think of it like freeze-dried camping food.
Freeze-dried food?
Hear me out. When you're packing for a long expedition, or in this case, sending your profile out across the massive public surface of the job market, you can't carry a full, heavy cooked meal. It spoils, it gets exposed, it is too much to carry safely. So you compress it, you freeze-dry it. On the surface, in the package, it doesn't look like a 5-star meal. It is highly abstracted, but the moment you add water, which in our professional world is the context of a private interview, it expands into the full experience.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
In that controlled, often mutually confidential environment of an interview, you can safely rehydrate the situation. You can expand on the constraints, the decisions you made, and the learnings. You can explain exactly why the work was difficult without breaching the client's core trust. The public rendering is just the lightweight structural interface meant to trigger that next interpretive event. It is a success, not a failure, that your most sensitive details require an interview to be fully accessed.
I will admit, the freeze-dried food metaphor perfectly captures the mechanics of compression and rehydration. Structurally, it makes complete sense within the LPR framework. But let's look at the fatal flaw in the real world.
Which is?
If the freeze-dried meal looks completely unappetizing on the outside of the package, nobody buys it. You never get to the campsite to add the water.
That is a fair counterpoint.
It is the reality of the vulnerability this creates. If your public safe rendering is too sanitized, if it relies on qualitative, soft effectiveness, because all your powerful performance metrics are locked away, it may never generate the interview required to rehydrate it in the first place. The text says, we need to create enough confidence for the next interpretive event. If the compression fails to do that, you are crossing your fingers and hoping the private record does the heavy lifting. But the hiring manager never sees the private record.
So you think the market absolutely demands exposure to make a decision?
I think the market demands proof. If a recruiter is comparing two candidates, and candidate A has non-confidential, highly specific metrics, say, reduced intake processing time by 40%, and candidate B, our highly disciplined practitioner, has a public-safe rendering that just says stabilized handoffs. Well, candidate A gets the interview. Candidate B never gets the chance to rehydrate their perfectly governed private record. The abstraction becomes a professional liability.
That is a very real vulnerability, and I concede that it happens. But I would counter that you are looking at the bullet point in isolation. And the job market rarely works like that. Candidate B does not rely on a single, isolated claim to win the interview. This is exactly why the material focuses so heavily on value patterns rather than isolated heroic outcomes.
Value patterns over single metrics?
Yes, a single public safe rendering might seem abstract or less appetizing on its own. But a resume or profile built from a consistently maintained professional record is a cohesive document. If your history consistently shows a pattern over 5 years of, say, turning scattered practices into clearer tools across multiple roles, different environments, and different constraints, the pattern itself becomes the verifiable signal. The trust density you are looking for doesn't have to come from exposing one massive, confidential financial win. It comes from the undeniable consistency of a professional capability.
I agree that consistency is a strong signal, but let's interrogate the idea that a value pattern fully compensates for a lack of hard, specific evidence on the surface. We know we have to rigorously avoid overclaiming, right? We review everything to ensure we aren't inflating our authority.
Right, that's fundamental.
But when we employ public safe rendering, we are systematically underclaiming on the public surface by design. We are intentionally holding back our strongest cards to protect the client. And tracking these diluted surfaces doesn't make them less diluted. For the hiring manager reading the resume, that public rendering is the only truth they have access to at that exact moment. A value pattern of turning scattered practices into clearer tools is a beautiful narrative, but without the jagged, specific edges of hard constraints and explicit outcomes, it risks becoming corporate poetry.
Corporate poetry.
Yes, it sounds nice, it flows well, but it lacks teeth. It places an immense and honestly precarious burden on the underlying private record to hold all the weight of the candidate's actual value, while the public surface is left to survive on whispers and outlines.
But those outlines are source-backed. They aren't corporate poetry because they are explicitly tied to documented evidence. If the public rendering says you coordinated something, you actually coordinated it. If it says you stabilized handoffs, you did. There is no inflation. The core discipline here is recognizing that evidence is not exposure.
That is a critical distinction to make.
It really is. You do not have to expose the client's vulnerabilities to prove your own worth. When we sanitize our professional surfaces to protect boundaries, I argue we are actually distilling our true value to its purest form. Think about it. We are removing the proprietary noise. We are stripping away the specific company's internal chaos, the specific software versions, the confidential financial drama, and we are isolating the exact professional capability you brought to the table. Public safe rendering proves that you can separate your capability from their proprietary detail. In many senior or sensitive roles, demonstrating that you know how to govern confidential information publicly is in itself a massive signal of professional competence.
I don't disagree that demonstrating discretion is a signal of competence. And I want to be very clear so we don't lose the plot here. Nobody is arguing for exposing protected data. The private record must contain the unvarnished, highly specific, unredacted truth, even if the public surface cannot bear that weight. The source must remain governed, and the truth of the evidence must exist before any rendering can take place.
So we align on the fact that you cannot let the demand for a strong resume drive you to violate a privacy boundary.
Absolutely. Publishing confidential details, patient data, or proprietary financials just to sound more impressive to a recruiter is a massive breach of trust. It invalidates you as a professional entirely.
We are in total lockstep there.
But where we diverge is the cost of that governance. We have to be intellectually honest about the trade-off we are making. Abstracting specific evidence, removing proprietary constraints, and hiding confidential outcomes inevitably softens the edges of exceptional work. It dilutes the immediate public weight of the claim. We are asking the market to recognize a shadow as clearly as the object itself. And in highly competitive spaces, that is a significant vulnerability. It places a huge burden on the future interviewer to prove the truth that the public surface is forbidden from showing.
What version of the truth belongs here for this audience? Public safe rendering represents the pinnacle of discipline in the LPR system. By separating the professional value pattern from proprietary details, the advisor protects both the client's capability and the employer's boundaries. It proves that governed selection is a sign of strength, not weakness.
And while respecting those boundaries is non-negotiable, we just have to accept that abstracting specific evidence dilutes the immediate weight of the claim. It's a delicate balance between preserving your competitive edge in the market and preserving the trust of those you work for.
As we wrap up today's discussion, it leaves us with a lingering question. When you take that metaphorical black marker and sanitize your professional surfaces to protect confidential boundaries, are you distilling your true value to its purest, most essential form? Or are you simply hiding your best evidence behind a necessary veil? There is much more to explore in the material, especially regarding how Tool 4C structures these difficult drafts. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.